And so, picking up where we left off in part one, um, kind of discussing the victims of their own success, and that the Mayan civilization basically outgrew the resources that were available to them in that part of the world. And so then you throw in some drought with an enormous population that was barely feeding itself when everything was right. 100-year drought, and you're going to have a problem. Now, making this problem worse was the fact that, maybe they could have come together and kind of crafted a solution to kind of get through this, right? That they could have pooled their resources, that they could have, opened up trade routes and kind of started to support each other. But the city states, because there was no unification, there was no, centralized government to coordinate the drought response, um, that these city state rivalries essentially prevented them from being strategic. And so instead of kind of supporting each other through this very difficult time, they started fighting for what was an increasingly limited amount of resources, um, and that spelled the end. And so, here we have some pretty what do you almost looks like calendars, but then we see in real life. And what's interesting about the Mayan civilization is they've actually continued to find Mayan cities in the jungle on the Yucatan, up until recently. I mean, I think there was a famous story like 10 years ago where an airplane using like laser topography was surveying the land, and had found basically irregularities where the jungle had come in and kind of grown over and like kind of overtaken these cities. And so they went and did this massive archaeological dig, and basically found um, this city. Actually, it's this one from the story, and this expanded for almost a half a mile in either direction, that the jungle had just basically consumed. And so it's now been excavated and you can visit it. But this is, I mean, there's continuing to find these sites all up and down the Yucatan Peninsula and down into Guatemala. So now we want to go into the next Central American civilization that emerged very close to the modern day city of Mexico City, right? To the District Federal. So, who or what was Teotihuacan? And so, Teotihuacan, pretty much up until much later, was America's greatest ancient city, right? It was begun as a relatively small settlement around 150 BCE, but within 700 years, oh, excuse me, within 700 years, the city had grown to be almost, 200,000 people, right? So almost a quarter of a million people in this massive city in central Mexico. And yeah, as we can, excavate it, and we're seeing all kinds of um, relics of this great civilization in this area right outside Mexico City. The interesting thing is much of it is still unknown. We don't know who ruled. We don't know, was it priests like we saw in the Mayan civilizations, the Olmecs? Was there a king? There is that is unclear. We know that there was a ruling class based off of the enormous pyramids that were there. But we also know that the influence of Teotihuacan, being such a great urban center, was massive over pretty much all of modern day Mexico, particularly enormous influence on the Aztec Empire to come. And so they were a city state, right? The city of Teotihuacan administered and ruled over 10,000 square miles around. So basically, an area a little bit smaller than Colorado, but basically Colorado ruled from the city of Teotihuacan. Um, they did go all the way down as far as the Mayan lands, but if you look at the dates here, um, they were in their golden age around the same time as the Mayans, and so there was trade between the two and competition. Um, they did have diplomatic connections with other areas. There is recent connection and evidence to point to that Teotihuacan in Mexico was actively trading with some of the bigger civilizations up in what is the United States of America. Um, with the Cahokia in particular, which is in Missouri, so a pretty long distance trade route developing there. Um, Obviously, like I said, major trading empire and an enormous influence on Central American culture, right? So if we were to kind of track the seed of culture with the Olmec into the Toltec, into the Mayan and Teotihuacan, and we're going to kind of get to the Aztec before too much longer. You can see here it's just outside. If you have ever visited Mexico City, perhaps you've even visited the World Heritage Site, which is the Pyramids of the Sun and the Pyramids of the Moon, two enormous pyramids facing each other over a large plaza. Here is one. Every year, I usually have students bring me in pictures of like, oh, here's me on the Pyramid of the Sun. So if you have ever been there, I would love to hear from it. I always think that that's neat. Um, and we're going to finish on this particular chapter or this section here. So we looked at with the previous civilization of Norte Chico. Um, we're tracking kind of the evolution of these civilizations in the Andes mountain regions of South America, right? Okay, and so my recording got disturbed here, and I don't know exactly where I left off, but I was kind of making the claim here that the Chavin, which you can see some brief notes on, is kind of a religious pilgrimage society, is really only significant as we kind of put it in the timeline of these Andean mountain civilizations that sort of arose around the Norte Chico civilization that we looked at earlier, and runs through the Chavin, this very religious um, movement full of hallucinogenic cactus and pilgrimages from people around the areas. But the significance is simply that it is a stepping stone in the path of the progression of Andean mountain civilization that eventually do lead to the Aztecs. And so moving on, um, leaving behind some pretty strong relics of a civilization that is influencing in the area. And now we're going to talk, and actually, we're not going to end here. I'm going to call this, I didn't assign these chapters for the textbook, so we're going to call the lecture here. I am going to put for tomorrow a key terms matching assignment that is a great introduction um, to studying prior to Monday's upcoming summative assessment on periods 1 and 2. So pay attention for the directions of that. Please paste the pictures of your notes in the box. Have a good day, and I'll see you on Thursday.